Hello, I'm Kai Rosga, and welcome to Version Up, one lawyer's journey to digitally transform his legal practice. Thank you for joining. I hope you enjoy this episode and learn a few things, but please don't take anything I say too seriously. This is not my day job, and all views expressed here are my own. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about what it means for a subject matter expert to deploy LegalTech and what sorts of things so-called SMEs are looking for and how tools can be developed to address those needs. I'm an antitrust lawyer, so what that means is I apply a very specific area of the law in various contexts to support businesses. This could be done as an in-house lawyer working for a legal department or on an outside counsel basis working at a law firm representing many clients. I have done both in my career, and I'd say in both it would be accurate to describe me as a subject matter expert or SME. The idea of an SME is that you are highly specialized. You have been brought in to address a specific legal question. And while the area of law that you advise on is very particular, you might be involved in very different contexts. For example, I might advise on transactions. I might advise on commercial deals. I might advise on M&A transactions. But ultimately, regardless of how I'm brought in, I answer a very narrow set of questions arising under the antitrust or competition laws. I'm also, as a SME, going to be responsible for structuring and carrying out a compliance program that has to do with antitrust issues or antitrust risks. Again, whether I am in-house or working at a law firm, I might find myself representing a client or working internally at a company, creating a compliance program, which is made up of structures, processes, people that help ensure that the organization stays compliant with the antitrust laws. Why am I telling you all this on a LegalTech podcast? Well, the reason is because I wanted to show how even in a highly specialized legal role supporting a business such as mine, lawyers are thinking about how to use technology, and that includes in-house lawyers and includes lawyers at law firms. And the common theme for how those lawyers think about using technology in their practice is to achieve efficiency, to do things quicker, better, faster, and effectiveness, to be reaching conclusions that are accurate and making fewer mistakes. And I guess if you're an outside counsel lawyer, you also might be thinking of how to improve your earnings or revenue. So that brings me to the big legal conference that was in Washington, D.C. last week that I attended. It is an antitrust conference. It's the ABA Antitrust Spring Meeting. And it is a very large gathering of antitrust practitioners from all around the world. And it's something that I've been attending every year of my 15-year career. And historically, I will say that legal tech has not been a major topic of discussion. If it came up mostly in the context of discussing e-discovery. E-discovery these are the vendors that create software used to help with the discovery process in litigation or investigations. So that includes digitizing documents and materials that are relevant to a litigation or investigation. It includes automating the process of collecting those documents, identifying the ones that are relevant to the case, reviewing those materials, analyzing them. All of that is part of what e-discovery tools do. And I will say that in my experience, e-discovery tools and vendors have really been at the frontier of using machine learning in legal software. And I do look forward to covering that technology in a future episode. But beyond the discovery vendor context, whether or not or what kind of technology is used to answer a legal question or address the needs of a lawyer is not something that would be covered normally in the ABA Spring Meeting or, frankly, almost any legal conference that I attend throughout the year, where the conference is really about focusing on supporting lawyers and understanding the legal landscape. Rather, if you're looking for information about how to use technology, that is not something you would typically see come up at these conferences. However, that seems to be changing. And my experience last week at the ABA Spring Meeting definitely felt that way. And I will say that to me, the bottom line is that legal tech is increasingly a part of the conversation, not just among vendors, but really every practitioner seems to be now thinking in some way about how can they use technology to upgrade their practice. So last year at the same meeting, I moderated a panel. It was a panel about using technology to support compliance at companies. And really, my goal in moderating that panel was to expand the discussion beyond just those e-discovery tools that I mentioned. And to me, compliance was one area to explore how legal tech is evolving well beyond its origins. And really, it's the Cambrian explosion of use cases and of ideas and of ways to deploy technology, in particular AI powered technology, to support all aspects of a lawyer's work, including compliance. And to me, compliance has several key ingredients of a corporate function that is primed for technological disruption. First of all, there's the cost aspect of compliance at a company. The people and the resources that are spent to maintain a compliance program can be significant. There's also the cost that is the opportunity cost to the business of failing to have adequate compliance or having a compliance program that maybe is not a good fit for the company's needs, or maybe having a compliance program that is slow or ineffective. All of those things lead to opportunity costs for the business as it waits for an answer or as it tries to navigate uncertainty without good guidance and a good, clear compliance structure. And the other cost that I see as a key one for an organization when it comes to compliance is, of course, the legal risk of not complying. There's the fines and there's the other penalties and other consequences that can result from having an ineffective compliance program. So the first key ingredient of why compliance is a good area to consider for legal technology deployment is the cost side. There are significant costs to deploying compliance, and there are significant costs to failing to do so effectively. The other key ingredient to me is the presence of repetitive tasks or workflows within the compliance program, which are an alarm that should go off to signal that there's potential for legal tech deployment to automate those tasks and those workflows. In the context of compliance, that could be generating training materials. Those of us that have done compliance in our careers know generating decks that are tailored to the audience that we are focused on meeting with and training on compliance can be a rather repetitive and manual task, but one that is important to making sure the content that we present is good. Another example would be on the workflow front, the checklists that emerge internally. These could be formal, they could be informal, they could be in people's heads, they could be written down. But the point is some notion of a checklist for performing specific tasks that ensure compliance with the law. So for example, that could be a checklist related to the execution of a contract and the review and the revision and the approval in order to get a contract completed. That's the kind of checklist that also, ding, 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 the bell should go off. If you have something that's sort of repetitive, you have a workflow that is done in the same way over and over in the same structured way, that should tell you there's a potential for automation. So that's why the panel that I had done last year compiled some in-house antitrust lawyers and focused on how technology could be used in the compliance function. But to me, what's important when you talk about legal tech in these sorts of contexts is to not come in at it from a high level general compliance perspective. I actually think it's very valuable to come at it from the perspective of a specialized lawyer such as myself, because it's only in getting into the weeds of what are the specific issues that someone like me might be advising on or running into. That's where you identify the specific use cases that might be driving the development of technology to help streamline the legal process and the legal work that we do. Those specific use cases, by the way, can then be extrapolated to other areas of the law. And so ultimately, these tools can be deployed more widely and can form the basis for a wider compliance program at a company. But in my experience, some of the more interesting ideas out there, some of the more interesting innovation I've seen on the compliance side has been in tools that are not all in one, but rather something that is very specific and tailored to the needs of a individual subject matter expert such as myself. At this year's ABA Antitrust Section Spring Meeting, I continued down the compliance technology path and was invited to speak on a panel about antitrust compliance. Although the focus of the panel was not on technology, the topic did come up. And interestingly, it came up from not just the panelists who were other in-house lawyers like me, it also came up in the Q&A that we got from a very active and interesting audience. One of the co-panelists brought up the potential of agentic AI. AI agents or agentic AI is the building of AI-powered tools to perform specific tasks or solve specific workflows or problems. But instead of having to define each step rigidly, which results in a static system, the Gen AI large language model based tools are much more nimble and adaptive, and they create a system that is not static, it is dynamic, and it is not pegged or fixed to the very rigid if A, then B, then C sort of logic that you might have seen if deploying earlier generations of AI-powered tools that claimed to help automate workflows, of which there have been many up to now, and many of them are quite effective. But the sort of Gen AI or LLM revolution, I think what it brings to the picture is this sort of adaptability. And ultimately, what it involves is taking those out-of-the-box large language models like your chat GPTs and building a tool on top of it that can answer specific questions tailored to specific subject matter. So clearly, this is something that has a lot of potential and could be very useful for subject matter experts like myself. We have very specific questions to ask. We need very specific answers to those questions. So generally applicable all-in-one AI tools are not always good enough. And without getting into the technical aspects, I would say that in my sort of simpleton view of things, there's a few problems that I run up against when I try to use those more generally run all-in-one tools. First of all, in my view, they're just not smart enough, meaning I give them very detailed questions because that is the kind of challenges that I face on a day-to-day basis. But the answers I get are inaccurate, they might be simplistic, or they might be incomplete. The other problem I run into with some of these more generally applicable tools is that they just don't sound or talk right. It feels like I'm translating to the tool from the way that I think about something as a subject matter expert. And then once I get a response from the tool, I'm then figuring out how to translate that back into my language before I actually generate something for my client. For example, whether that be an internal client as an in-house lawyer or whether that be a client from an outside counsel basis. And so there's just a clunkiness to that translation that comes from the fact that the generally applicable tool just doesn't quite seem to think and talk like someone in my specific area would talk. Finally, the other gap I see in those general broad-based tools is that they rely on too large of a corpus of information. And that results in hallucinations, which are quite troubling to a lawyer. And also, even short of hallucination, just getting a lot of irrelevant information. In my view, AI agents that are tailored to the needs of a legal professional, especially ones that are designed for the specific needs and use cases that I have within my area of expertise, those are the ones that really interest me and I think have a lot of potential. Those sorts of tools will be trained on a more limited and appropriate set of information, or at least the answers they give will be focused on that information. And they will also be structured to solve the specific problems that I deal with, which means that the person developing that tool, it's not trying to create a fix everyone's problem kind of solution. That vendor is trying to come up with a a way to really understand what are the specific tasks and questions that I run into in my specific area of the law and try to address those. For example, an AI agent that I've spoken about in a past episode might look like a help desk or a self-service center, which would be a place where other legal professionals within my organization or business people or clients, if you're an outside lawyer, would go to the help desk and they could quickly get some initial scoping out of the answer to their question through a chatbot interface, for example. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about AI agents. I'm seeing more of these AI agents that are tailored to specific needs of particular areas of the law, and a movement away from the notion that all-in-one tools for all lawyers of all types are going to be a adequate solution for everyone. And so personally, I expect we'll see more of these subject matter expert specific capabilities and features. And I think that's exciting. And it's also, to me, consistent with broader AI trends that I'm seeing, which is no longer a singular focus on underlying large language models, but increasingly more attention to the tailored tools that are being developed and built on top of them that address specific needs of individual users. AI agents was an interesting topic raised by a co-panelist. Also very interesting were the questions that we got from the audience, which notably all focused on how technology can be used to bolster compliance. And one topic specifically that came up was the idea of monitoring or auditing business people's activities to flag conduct that could be problematic. First of all, I think it was very telling that this was the item that the audience seemed to be most interested on, and especially given that the panel itself really didn't spend much time talking about legal tech. It talked more broadly about what does a good antitrust compliance program look like. But the fact that this auditing or monitoring feature was one major focus of the questions, I thought was notable and really signaled to me that lawyers are thinking really far ahead already about how legal tech can improve legal practice in-house and as outside law firms. And the monitoring tools, and this was part of my response, but I guess this is my opportunity to fill that response in with the benefit of a little more time. First of all, such tools do exist. So we do have AI-powered legal tech software out there that conducts auditing and monitoring to bolster compliance at large corporates. So the auditing function would be something that involves an occasional snapshot of conduct at the company to assess risk, to see how the company is doing, to identify any shortfalls, follow up on any specific conduct that might be problematic. That's what an audit looks like. It's a one-time snapshot. You do it occasionally and you learn from it and you improve your program from it. And existing e-discovery vendors have sold this as a capability for quite a while as part of their wider suite of tools. And now we have also a lot of startups that claim to have standalone products that do it better, faster, and cheaper. But it's not a new idea, but certainly you see startups improving on that idea and using the latest iterations of AI to improve function. So auditing is the first feature of these tools. The other is monitoring. This is like auditing, but done more in real time or on a more regular basis. I would say this is probably less common in the private sector, just because anytime you do one of these audits, or it costs time and money, and it takes away from other priorities you might have as an organization. So to do an audit, an occasional audit is one thing, but to monitor on an ongoing basis is quite another. And so this is an area where the more advanced AI capabilities have the potential to really increase the ability of firms to do such monitoring, because if you have AI that can automate this and can do it efficiently and accurately, then you could start seeing companies considering deploying legal tech to monitor their business's activities on a more day-to-day basis. What you'll see from some of the products in the market is that these monitoring tools have, of course, two aspects to them. The first being the capability to follow and track and flag conduct through dashboards or alerts or other ways for the legal professional, for example, a compliance officer or even a subject matter expert who is focusing on that area of risk. The third way that you'll see monitoring capabilities appear in these legal tech products is in the form of real-time feedback. So for those who are familiar with the tool Grammarly, this is the tool that when you are writing your email, love it or hate it, it provides you some suggestions for how to tweak your wording, how to improve your language, maybe fix some language that might come off in a way that you don't want it to. And it's really embedded in your email program or it's embedded somewhere else where you're typing to, in real time, suggest changes. The idea is to bring that same feature, that same function into compliance. And the way that that would work is when someone's writing an email, when someone's writing a message, they are getting real-time feedback if they are engaging, writing something that could create risk for the organization or that could suggest a intention to do something inappropriate or even unlawful, and that this feedback in real time can help stop conduct from happening before it does. And clearly, this is the most proactive of the features you would see that we've discussed, from auditing being the occasional snapshot to monitoring being the more regular sort of audit. Real-time feedback is the most proactive of all the options because you are there as the conduct is potentially happening. And it's also the most recent addition to these capabilities and probably most dependent on the most powerful and recent iterations of AI. And perhaps that's why we're only starting to see these capabilities emerge, but we are seeing them in the market. In my view, this technology, the monitoring, the auditing, the real-time feedback, it all has a lot of potential. And this is definitely something that probably will start to be a component of many compliance programs and will be a component of how many subject matter experts and advisors do their work. It looks like some of these tools work pretty well, but there are a lot of practical challenges to deploying these sorts of tools, especially at a larger corporate. And the list is quite significant at this stage. A few that I would note is cybersecurity issues surrounding whether data that's being generated in the dashboards and the analytics or through the real-time feedback, is that all hosted in a way where all that information is not at risk of being accessed by an inappropriate third party? So cybersecurity is definitely a concern for any tool, but perhaps this one especially so. Privacy is a big issue here. So for those that have experience advising larger international corporations, they know that there are a lot of jurisdictions where this sort of conduct, especially the real-time monitoring, but also some of the more regular monitoring as well, would potentially be an issue in complying with local domestic privacy rules. Or you could also have labor laws that exist that are not just privacy rules, but that are labor rules that would, again, be significant barriers potentially to deploying such a tool for employees that fall within the jurisdiction that has those rules. There's also the employee morale aspect of this, the idea that kind of you have a big brother employer that is watching your every move. That perception can be something that corporates may try to avoid because they may think that that undermines their ability to hire top talent. There's also the issue of legal privilege, which is going back to the data that's generated as a part of deploying these tools. Is it going to be subject to disclosure in investigations or litigation? Or can you assert a legal privilege over those tools and be able to argue that they are being used to advise on legal questions? That is something that is very much in development in the case law. And it's also going to be an area of the law that's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So any large multinational company is going to be very careful about understanding and navigating the privilege implications of using any kind of tool that creates records, data, analysis of communications from its employees. Relatedly, there's a question of what is the implication on document retention. So a lot of companies have document retention protocols that set out how long documents are to be retained. There are many things that drive that. There are regulatory considerations, there are practical considerations, there are business considerations. But the bottom line is, if you have a protocol in place that sets out when certain data or documents should be kept for how long, that's going to have to be considered when you're deploying any of these tools that might be creating new data and reports, dashboards regarding employee communications. And finally, when I see vendors talk about these tools, especially the real-time monitoring capability, which, I understand the excitement around that, and I understand that that feels very kind of cutting edge, and it is. But one of the concerns I have with that is the potential for information overload for the users. And as a compliance professional and as a lawyer and as a subject matter expert, throughout my career, I always think about my client and what is comfortable, what is workable, what is practical for them, no matter what the context is. And the idea of creating more pop-ups, creating more disruption or friction in their work is always something you have to think very carefully about, even if on the other end of it is maybe a sharper compliance program, but you always have to balance a sharper compliance program against all those other issues. And finally, if you are relying too much on these tools, are you sort of missing the big picture? Meaning, are you missing the whole point of having an effective compliance program to the point where is the technology really becoming a crutch in the sense? And what I mean by that is if the ultimate aim of a good compliance program is to promote a strong culture of compliance and power individuals to engage in self-help and identify risks and stop themselves from engaging in conduct that may be unlawful, stopping others from doing so. If that's the goal of a compliance program, when you start using technology that is not nimble enough to adapt to a new risk or issue within the company, and that risk gets missed because, for example, no one is applying their independent judgment, no one is applying their own critical thinking, and instead they're on autopilot, relying on the fact that there's this software running in the background that's looking over them. Well, does that create new legal risk for the company? And does it mean that you have weakened some aspect of your compliance culture by relying too heavily on technology to fulfill a function that at its core, in some way, will always be a human question and a human challenge, which is that human beings will be making decisions for the business. They will be interacting with each other. They'll be interacting with people outside the company. And they all need to understand at some level what is the boundary of appropriate and inappropriate conduct. And relying on a technology, it's almost like becoming so dependent on a navigation system in your car that when you drive into a remote area and you lose your internet access, all of a sudden you're lost and you don't know how to pick up a map and find your way home. So my expectation for these sorts of legal tech tools, especially again, as someone who's a subject matter expert who's really thinking about the specific ways that issues and risks come up at an organization, I would think this over time, these sorts of tools will become some component of a compliance program, but I can't see a world where they become an end-all solution. It might be a good second line of defense. It might be a good sanity check. Ultimately, I think it will be deployed very tactically and specifically by companies to address specific needs and risks of the organization, as opposed to being something that just becomes a default. Finally, I want to share a few other takeaways from the conference and meeting with lawyers and other legal professionals in my field of antitrust. And the first one is a real notable uptick in interest in legal tech. I say that as someone who is interested in legal tech and who might be inclined to introduce this into a conversation, but I also say that as someone who was listening and even in conversations where I had not raised it, it kept coming up. And that hasn't happened before. I think in past years, I might have been the one to start the conversation, but it was rare that I would see someone else bring it up and I was responding. And increasingly, I'm seeing it coming up in both contexts. And I'm hearing it from inside counsel, so lawyers that work in legal departments of corporations. And I'm also hearing it from outside counsel, law firms that represent many different companies and individuals. And that is really notable, and it's something that tracks more general observations I've made that this does feel like the moment where legal tech is coming out of its infancy and it is really beginning to approach some stage of high growth in adoption and really the idea that lawyers would trust these tools, that they would believe that they were worth adding to their existing practice and overcome what are really significant barriers that cause lawyers to be hesitant to change how they do things. So on the law firm side, you have lawyers of sort of what we call the big law firms. These are the premier top tier law firms. And from their perspective, one of the things that is causing them to think hard about legal tech is that lawyers at those law firms always want to continue to go up the value chain. They want to focus their practice and their time on high value added work. They want to bill at higher rates for that work. And they want to rely less on high output, low value work. And that means relying less on what has traditionally been a business model tied to having a large number of associates and more junior attorneys doing that high volume, lower value work. And technology is seen as a way for premier law firms to go up that value chain and make that transition. After the premier big law firms, there's a large mid-tier of law firms, which can be significantly sophisticated, large organizations, but they are competing in a more competitive environment. And to compete in that environment, they often are looking for cost advantage and the ability to bill their clients at a more competitive rate. And technology is certainly one way where it seems like these sorts of firms are thinking about how can they cut their costs, how can they become more efficient, and therefore be able to pass on that efficiency through lower billable rates and be able to land more business as a result. Finally, there are what I call the boutique firms. So within my area of expertise as an antitrust lawyer, that would be an antitrust boutique. And that would be a law firm that is much smaller than the others I've just mentioned and focused entirely on one or a couple of areas of the law. And those firms seem to be thinking about technology to really fill the capacity gap that they have from an absence of having just a lot of bodies around. And what I mean by that is if you are providing antitrust support as an outside law firm and you want to go after the kind of work that generates the big deals and the big litigations or the big investigations, you have to be able to convince a client that you have the capacity to quickly jump on a big matter or jump on a big investigation and wrap your hands around it, and that you're not going to be slow or inefficient or ineffective at addressing that need because you don't have enough associates, for example, supporting you on your team. And technology for those sorts of firms has the ability to fill that gap. And as everyone becomes more comfortable with the idea that technology is able to do that, they're going to be able to make that pitch more effectively to their clients and saying, look, we have excellent top level senior lawyers that can do the strategic thinking that you need us to do for this matter. And although we don't have 30 or 40 associates supporting us, we have enough associates combined with technology to do an as effective job as the competition. So those are just some examples of the ways that I'm hearing different ways that law firms are thinking about deploying technology. And all of those law firms, one thing in common, which is they're also all responding to pressures from their clients, the clients being the companies and in some cases individuals that retain them. And again, I'm focusing specifically on my area of expertise in antitrust, but I think this applies in a lot of different niche areas of the law. And what we're seeing is lawyers at companies that are in-house are looking to decrease their outside counsel spend. They're looking to also decrease the pressure on their limited internal capacity. And so naturally, they're going to look to technology to do that, whether it's to decrease the outside counsel spend or whether it's to uh, become more efficient internally and be able to do more with less. And that is putting a pressure on law firms to adopt these tools. That also means that the same in-house lawyers might be deploying these tools internally to make their own systems more efficient and to, again, address that pressure that they might be experiencing on their capacity to meet the legal needs of their organization without hiring more people. So bottom line, from both a supply and demand side in the legal sector, you really are seeing this push towards legal tech deployment. And something that really jumped out at me from the 3-4 days I spent just meeting and exchanging ideas and hearing from other legal professionals in my tiny nook of the legal universe. But I do think that it really draws on some of the same themes and challenges and opportunities that other lawyers are experiencing, and especially lawyers who, like myself, would be viewed as subject matter experts who have specific needs, have specific challenges, and although sometimes we'll find broad-based tools really helpful and effective, often we'll also instead be looking for very tailored solutions. And that's something we're seeing in the market being offered by vendors increasingly, and something that will be a focus of future episodes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Version Up. If you have comments or questions, you can reach me at kairozga@gmail.com. This podcast has been bootstrapped by me, Kai Rozga, with music by Brett Krydak.